Steve, various cosmologists, theologians for sure, would point to the nature of consciousness, the existence of mind, as something that's not only important for human beings, obviously, but is fundamentally necessary to understand the structure of reality, the whole cosmos. I come to you as a philosopher who has really studied consciousness in many interesting ways to explore the legitimacy of that argument.
That's a complicated argument. If it turns out, as I believe and others believe, that our psychological descriptive categories can't be translated without residue into, say, purely physical or physiological categories, then there is something that we need to understand about the psychological realm that can't be accounted for any other way.
And this is not what we call an epiphenomena, an artifact, something that's emergent, that is not just the product in some way, however complicated, of the physical world.
Well, even if it's an emergent property, once it's emerged, and if it isn't just an epiphenomenon, it still needs to be explained.
Certainly needs to be explained, but there's a difference if it emerges from the physical world, then it is, in a sense, derivative. But some cosmologists, theologians say that it is more fundamental than that. It is not just, it may emerge as the process, but in terms of its existence, it is fundamental for us to understand in order to understand the whole of reality. That's the crux.
Well, I wish I had a view about which came first, the physical or the mental, and I don't have an answer to that. But since it seems to me transparently the case that there is a psychological realm, and since that realm can't be translated or understood completely in terms of another kind, then it seems we have no choice but to take that part of reality and understand its place in the bigger picture.
So you're saying that because the mental world cannot be reduced to the physical world, it's something that by force we have to consider, even though you're not sure what the result may be.
Well, I don't know what the result may be, but I also don't know what the origin of the mental world might have been. And to me, in a way, that's irrelevant. It may turn out to be interesting, but it's irrelevant to the question of whether we need to understand the mental realm to understand nature as we experience it.
Why so?
Well, if it's a part of reality that can't be reduced to, say, physical terms, if it can't be understood in purely physical or physiological terms, then there's a whole set of data that needs to be understood on its own merits.
For example?
Well, let's just take the phenomenon of memory. If memory can't be analyzed, say, in terms of representations, engrams of some kind, which I believe is something that is true, it cannot be so understood, then
it's a radically different view. I don't know any neurophysiologist, neurochemist, neuroscientist who would go along with that argument. And speaking as somebody who was in that field, it seems rather incredible to me that we can say that a memory trace, an engram of memory, is not something just entirely the result of neurochemicals between neurons and the synapse between them and all different ways. Don't know how it 100% works, but scientists have made a huge amount of progress. You're saying there's something more to memory than what is in the brain?
I would say the very concept of a memory trace is incoherent. It's just bad philosophy dressed up in the language of the electrical engineer.
Well, explain that to me, because you got me baffled.
Well, this is one of the hardest, but also I think most interesting issues in the philosophy of mind. The reason I think the concept of a memory trace is literally incoherent is that for a trace to do the job that's assigned to it by neuroscientists, it either has to rely on an infinite regress of memory mechanisms to make sure that the initial mechanism does its job, or else it has to be the kind of mechanism whose structure determines its function. And the fact is, no mechanism is such that its structure determines its function.
I think I could argue with both sides of that. On the first, it would seem you don't need an infinite regress because if a trace, because of electrical impulses, keeps going around, it synthesizes some chemicals. It makes it more likely for this trace, whatever it is, an electrical to go. The place between the two neurons gets more sensitized, so it can pass more easily. I mean, there are mechanisms that don't seem to be infinite regresses.
Let me give you an example. Suppose we're at a party, and I want to remember who attended my party. So I ask each guest to leave behind some trace that they were there. Let's suppose each guest leaves behind a tennis ball. Now, it's clear that the tennis balls are not going to be the kind of unambiguous calling card that I need to recall who the tennis ball was left by. We need some other thing to make that memory mechanism work, that trace that they left behind. So suppose they attach something to it, like a signature or a photo. The fact is, the signature or the photo are equally functionally ambiguous. The signature could be illegible, the photo could be difficult to understand, and there's no reason to think that if somebody left behind a photo of me, that person would have to be me. So even that calling card isn't the kind of representational, unambiguous calling card that we need. We'd need another mechanism to explain how we applied that mechanism.
Okay, now I'm beginning to see the point, and it's very interesting. I think what you're saying is that there can be all these molecular changes in the brain, which may have something to do with memory, but translating easier flow of electrical activity or stronger chemical responses or whatever, how do you get from that to the very incredible rich sources of what our memories are?
Let me approach this from a different direction, because this is actually, I think, one of the most fascinating and also one of the hardest issues in the philosophy of mind. It can't be done quickly, but consider the following. In the 1920s, Carl Lashley had some interesting experiments in equipotentiality. He trained some rats to run a maze, and he thought he knew where in the rat's brain the memory of that was located. So he excised that portion of the brain, and he found out that the rat could still run the maze, although with a little less panache. And so he cut out some more of the rat's brain, and in fact, the rat could continue to run the maze. And he kept cutting out more and more of the rat's brain until there was maybe about 5% of the brain left. And at that point, the rat couldn't run the maze, but it couldn't do anything else either. Now, Lashley didn't make this mistake, but Karl Pribram and others looked at this and thought, that shows that memories are located diffusely in the brain as information is located diffusely in a hologram. It never occurred to Pribram that that interpretation rested on certain mechanistic assumptions he wasn't aware of and wasn't willing to abandon. To someone who's an anti-mechanist like myself, what that suggests instead is that the memories were never located in the brain in the first place, and that the container metaphor for this, that memories must be in something, might have been ill-conceived from the beginning.
That is extremely radical. I must say I'm a bit fascinated by it, but extremely skeptical, as you would expect me to be.
It has the virtue of being correct, however.
Well, I mean, I appreciate your enthusiasm and confidence, but some type of brain lesions, you do lose very specific abilities and memories of specific sensory modalities.
Sure, but it's a specious inference from the existence of brain lesions or other damage to suppose that there was a mechanism that accounted for the lost ability. I can rip out the treble strings in a piano, and certain kinds of music can't be made through the piano, but it doesn't follow that the music was in the piano.
So, assuming your line of arguments would be correct, what would be your conclusion about where the ultimate source of that memory really is?
Every scientist assumes, correctly I believe, that explanation by analysis, that is, explaining a phenomenon in terms of lower level phenomenon, is something that can't continue indefinitely, that sooner or later we have to come to some ground level primitive phenomena or regularities. And at that point, we've reached rock bottom. We can no longer ask at that point of those phenomena how they occur. That's simply the way the universe works. Now that's okay, I have no problem with that. Where most scientists go wrong, I think, is supposing that wherever these primitive phenomena are, they're always at the level of the very small, the neurological, the biochemical, the atomic, or the subatomic level, and never at the level of behavior. I call this the small is beautiful assumption. It's only an assumption, it's not an empirically established fact, and I think there are compelling a priori arguments to show that it's wrong. Now, what I'd say about memory is that memory is just one of any number of, a large number of psychological phenomena which have no analysis in terms of lower level processes, though they might be mediated by lower level processes. And the same would be true, for example, of verbal communication.
So where are these memories?
Why do they have to be anywhere? The fact is, we have memory behavior. We have certain things that we can do. We have certain basic abilities. We have the ability to remember.
That has to be stored someplace.
Why?
It seems incoherent to assume it's not.
Well, but if it turns out that the proposed mechanism of storage, the trace, is an impossible object, if it involves presupposing Platonic essentialism,
Which means
that
there's some
things of the same
realm,
kind are of the same kind in virtue of sharing some common essence,
some universal quality.
some universal quality. It turns out, for reasons that I don't think we have time to go into here, but I would argue that the very idea of a memory trace presupposes that philosophical view. And what it shows is that, well, basically like all scientific views, this is not a purely empirical conjecture, the conjecture that memory traces exist. It's actually a philosophical view, and I'd say it's a bad philosophical view. Platonic essentialism is a dead theory.
So again, this memory has to be stored. Tomorrow I'm going to remember that we had this talk today. Where is that memory?
I'd say that's not an appropriate question. You are like Pribram. I'd say you're locked into a certain way of looking at things. You're locked into a mechanistic way of thinking about this, that there has to be an underlying mechanism for it. You wouldn't ask...
I don't want a mechanism, and I'm coming to you because I want you to help me understand
Well, there'd have to be a mechanism of storage.
Yeah.
That is a mechanism.
Place. So, I mean, because I have different kinds of memories and different complex memories, and they change. So,
Sure.
So you're saying that it's not stored at a lower level? Is it stored at a higher level? Or you're saying the question of storage doesn't make sense?
Here, I would say it doesn't. And the way to see that it doesn't is that whenever you try to explain what kind of storage is possible, you end up making one philosophical error or another. You end up either positing an infinite regress, or you end up positing something like intrinsic similarity between things, between the trace and the thing it's a trace of. Wolfgang Köhler recognized that for a trace to do its job, he thought it had to be structurally isomorphic to the thing it's a trace of.
Which means?
Intrinsically similar in virtue of its structure. But the idea of intrinsic similarity is incoherent. Similarity is not a static two-term relation between things.
So is what you're saying, the concept of memory and things like it, is some inherent quality of reality that just is enabled by the existence of mind?
In that sense, it would be like some of the most fundamental positive principles in physics about which it doesn't help us to ask, well, how did they come about? That's just the way it is. And I recognize there's a lot of resistance to that, and that's because these phenomena are not at the level that people think fundamental phenomena must exist at.
So your ultimate answer is, that's just the way it is. It's a brute fact of reality. And that's the end of the story.
Well, it doesn't mean that all explanation comes to an end. It just means that explanation by analysis comes to an end. There are other forms of explanation. There are other forms of understanding. Concepts aren't isolated entities either. So explanation, understanding, intention, all of these are part of a conceptual package. And understanding memory doesn't have to mean breaking it down into lower level components or processes. It doesn't have to mean looking for some storage mechanism or process of storage or location for it. We might just have to change the metaphors, and we might have to revert to things like covering law explanations or explanation by analogy. There are all sorts of ways of explaining and understanding phenomena, and I'm suggesting that when it comes to the realm of the mental, we have to go about things much differently than many scientists are willing to do. We have to get over our physics envy, basically.